Hi everyone, my name is Scott Shell. If you would like to go ahead and check out my credentials concerning teaching, publications, and conferences and whatnot, go ahead and visit scottshell.net. So today I'm going to talk about Proto-Germanic diphthongs. In the past, if you've been following the series, we've talked about the Proto-Germanic short vowels, the Proto-Germanic long vowels, and how they sort of wind up in these other various Germanic languages, and then from looking at that data, that's how we actually reconstruct, as linguists, we reconstruct certain words. So today we're going to talk about the diphthongs, though, and not the monophthongs. So first off, what's a monophthong? That's just simply a single vowel, like E or A or Ah. But a diphthong, on the other hand, more or less sort of combines these two vowels for a single vowel nucleus, we would say, in the root. Like the root can still be, for example, ow. Instead of ah or oo, it's a combination of those two, like ow or I, so on and so forth. So if you look at English, for instance, we'll have words like loud. You can hear that it's la, oo. It's sort of gliding, right? Loud. It's not loud, it's not lewd, but loud. That is an example of a diphthong versus something like lute. Loud, lute. So you can hear in lute, it's just one single vowel. Another example could be English proud. So you hear that again, the per-oud, right? So ah-oo, proud, versus something like brood, right? So you have the two vowels with the ah and the oo versus brood. So proud is more of a diphthong sound, whereas brood is just, it's got that single vowel, the oo, the monophthong. And one last example is English sound. Sound. So again, you hear the ah into the oo. But then again, if you say the word song, it's a single vowel, right? It's a single vowel sound. So it's also important to not get caught up on orthography so much in English because, our writing system has not been updated for a very long time. And so we even say, things like sight, but it actually just has like one vowel there. But if you listen, it's actually s-a-e, right? Sight. It's actually a diphthong, but whatever the case, that's just roughly what a diphthong is. If you have any questions about a diphthong and how it's different from a monophthong, just go ahead and post it in the comments below. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with Proto-Germanic AU. The word I've provided to you here is a reconstruction for the verb to increase. It is either alkana or alkanon, depending on how you want to reconstruct that. Now, if we look at the data, we'll see that it's not so straightforward as like the monophthongs, right? The single vowels. We see, okay, if it's alkana or alkanon, then it shows up as okyan. In Old Saxon, it is reflected in Old English as etchian, and Old Norse is alka, and then Old High German is ohan, and then Gothic is alkan. So is it enough just to say like, okay, Proto-Germanic must have this sort of AU because Gothic has AU, because Gothic is a very old language? Maybe, but Gothic has its own sort of weird thing going on too sometimes, right? With its own sort of vowels that are changing, but these changes are being reflected only in Gothic and not the other languages. So this is where linguists want to look into the indo-European side of things for a little bit, just to, give us an idea as far as like what was the oldest vowel. Can we verify this through the other indo-European languages? And it turns out we can. So if we look at Lithuanian, Greek, and Latin, we'll see that the AU is preserved in all of those languages too. And so with that being taken into consideration, and then we see the AU in Gothic, and then the AU in Old Norse, it's like, okay, this must have been a Proto-Germanic AU, and then things like long O in Old Saxon, EA in Old English, OU in Old High German, like those shifts must have been specific to those languages. And as you'll see with the data I'm going to show you throughout the video, it's true. You're going to see those systematic shifts, right? That's what we want to look at. We want to look at typologies and systems. So again, these videos are showing you how linguists know that words are related, and it's not just, arbitrary. So of course, I got to throw one more example in here too for AU, runic, right? So we see this AU preserved in Laukas. So many of my viewers are familiar with that word. It just means leak. But that AU is clearly preserved in Old Norse, and it's unattested in Gothic, which is why I didn't give you all the attestations here. But either way, that AU diphthong is preserved in runic laukaz in all kinds of bracteates and other objects too. All right, for my next example, you're going to see rauvo or rauvas. Two different reconstructions for this word, but still comes from the same root. So in Old Saxon, we see rolf, right? So you're kind of expecting that, right? Because you just saw that AU systematically shifted to long O in Old Saxon. So that's how we get our new long O in Old Saxon. We see ref in Old English, and again, you see that systematic EA shift from the AU. And then in Old Norse, we see rauf, and then we see Old High German rob. So again, we see that systematic shift of that AU shifting in Old High German to OU. And then finally in Gothic, we see rauba. This doesn't actually exist in Gothic. This is a reconstruction, but again, the systematic shifts are still there. Like we can predict in Gothic, like this is what it would have been if it did exist in Gothic. And again, we have more Lithuanian data there where the AU is preserved. So indo-european is informing our decision to further informing our decision to reconstruct an AU in Proto-Germanic. All right, so let's go ahead and look at a third example for AU. The word that I've given you here is Proto-Germanic raudhas. This is just red in Proto-Germanic. And, theoretically, you should already expect some of these vowel changes. Like what would you expect in Old Saxon? You would expect a long O, right? Well, that's what we get. Rolt. You would expect an EA in Old English, like with all the other examples I've given you. So we have now reat, which sounds very close to red, right? So you're seeing the direct reflex right there. Outside of Old English, we then have Old Norse, rauther or roider. Again, depending on your preference for pronunciation of Old Norse versus modern Icelandic. Then we have rauths in Gothic, rauths. So you see that the AU again is preserved in Gothic, again it's preserved in Old Norse, and you see all of the systematic changes, again, in unconditional environments, except for Old High German right there. It was actually a mistake on my part. I was trying to give you all these sound shifts without specific conditioned environments, but this one crept in. It's real easy to talk about those. So essentially, the AU shifts to OU in Old High German, unless, in this case, a dental or a T or a D would appear right after that vowel, and then it becomes a long vowel. So now you can see why conditioned environments can get kind of crazy, and I'm trying to just talk about the unconditioned environments right now. But either way, you do expect that long O in Old High German from AU. It's just that a dental would have to follow after that vowel. All right, now we have Proto-Germanic AI. Let's go ahead and look at the word for goat in Proto-Germanic. It is geitz, and we see that the AI shifts to a long E in Old Saxon, so we get yet, palatalized, yet, and then we see Old English, goat. So you can already sort of hear that shift, right, from guts to goat in Standard English. After Old English, we then have Old Norse with gate, and then Gothic finally with geitz. So in this case, only Gothic has the AI. So it's like, why do we reconstruct it as AI again in Proto-Germanic? And that's where we have to look at older data, right? We have to look at the runic inscription I've provided to you here, for instance, for the word for stone is still stein, right? As in, I colored the stone in this particular example from the Vetelan stone. And then, of course, if we look at Lithuanian, we have žaiju and then žaisti. So you can still see that the AI is preserved in Lithuanian, and at least the A is preserved in Latin, as you see here too, with haidus. All right, and so our next one is going to be tainas. So you'll see that the AI is going to systematically again shift to a long E in Old Saxon. So we have tain. You will see that the AI will systematically shift to a long A in Old English, which is why we have ton. We then see that Old Norse shifts to tain, which we would expect, tain. After that, we see Old High German coming in from Proto-Germanic with sein, and then finally Gothic with tains. And of course, you can see this in the other Indo-European languages too, like Greek with daitai. So you can see that the A and the I is preserved in another Indo-European language. This is, of course, exactly related to tainas, as in the Greek form, daitai. So you see that the AI is preserved even in Greek there. So again, with the runic evidence, with this diphthong, with the Greek evidence, it's safe to reconstruct this as AI into Proto-Germanic and say those other weird shifts are just specific to those other languages. All right, and for our last example here for AI, we have heimas. This is just home in Proto-Germanic. So most of you are probably already familiar with this word, but now you can know how this word is related and the sort of reflexes that we expect. So heimas, right, the high diphthong, goes to long E in Old Saxon, like we've already explained with tainas and geits. So what would we expect? Heim, right? That root vowel is going to shift to that long E. Heim. In Old English, we would expect that long A, right? Home, or home, right? It's so close. You see that HAM spelling in words like Nottingham and Birmingham and so on and so forth, this sort of archaic way of spelling these words. Finally, we have Old Norse heimir, and then we have Gothic heims, and then we have Old High German heim. So again, you should see all of those systematic shifts, and Gothic is the one that retains that original diphthong. And of course, we see this actually reflected in Lithuanian too with kaimas. Finally, our third and final diphthong in Proto-Germanic is going to be EU. When I hear people pronounce this vowel, even in the older languages, it's something like AU or something like that, and it's not really quite that, because if you say AU, it sounds like two different vowels. It's more like AU, right? So anyway, the word that I'm going to provide to you here is Theuthanos. And this is just a word that means master of a people. That na is actually like a master suffix or a lord, or as we'll see in just a minute, a mistress over something, whether it's a forest or people or whatever. So Theuthanos is how you say that, not Theuthanos, Theuthanos. And so we'll see in Old Saxon, Theodon, right? Not Theodon, but Theodon. It becomes EO. It is actually also reflected as with an IO in Old Saxon too, but for our purposes here, the EO is closer to Proto-Germanic, so we're going to go with that. In Old English, it's also Theodon, and then in Old Norse, Thjóðan, right? I'm not saying Theodon, right? Thjóðan, it's Thjóðan. And then in Old High German, we have Djot. That's actually not the exact reflex. The exact reflex for this word in Old High German would just be Djotan. But this is unattested. And then finally, in Gothic, we have Thjóðans. So again, you can hear how I'm pronouncing it as a single, almost like a single cluster, not really a single vowel, but two vowels, which just makes up a single nucleus. So now you're probably wondering too, how in the world do we reconstruct this as EU if none of the Germanic reflexes have EU, right? And it's kind of messy now. Well, if we go look at runic evidence, we do see that Leobnes, in this case, is a runic inscription I've given you dated to around 350 CE. It actually preserves the EU, and it just means like dear to me. And then if we look into Greek, we see, specifically Illyrian, we see Teuta. So that EU is preserved in this example of Greek. It's also preserved in runic. And really in the oldest attestations, you have that EU. And so we would reconstruct that into Proto-Germanic as EU. and then say, okay, these other languages went through shifts specific to those languages. Again, like EU becoming EO in Old Saxon, or even EO in Old English. So with my next example, you're going to also see the same systematic shifts. So it may look a little chaotic until you start putting all of the data together, and you're like, oh, okay, I see. It systematically does these things. So now we have the Proto-Germanic verb to choose, kausana or kausanan. Again, depending on your reconstruction, but let's look at the reflexes. Old Saxon, we see kausan, kausan, just like we saw previously with thaudan, right? So we're still seeing the systematic shift. With Old English, we see cheosan, cheosan, choose, right? So you can hear that cheosan, chosen, choose, right? Choose. Old Norse, we see kjosa. Again, the shift is specific to Old Norse. It's actually in Old High German too, but it's just spelled with an I, but it's pronounced the same way. Which I guess leads me to Old High German, kjosan, kjosan. Notice I'm not saying kiosan. I'm saying kjosan. So whenever you see an I in these old languages, if you study these old languages, and you're like, is that a kiosan or is it kyosan? You can't answer that question. It's just you have to think about it now as a linguist in a way to sort of say, oh, did this come from this diphthong in Proto-Germanic? If it did, then it's going to be kyosan. If it didn't, then you could pronounce it like an I. Again, if it came from, an I in Proto-Germanic or whatever. And then we have Old Norse kjosa. Kjosa. It's not kiosa, right? It's kjosa. And then we have Old High German kjosan. Kjosan. So it's not kiosan, but kjosan. Even though it's spelled with an I, it's what we call palatalized because it comes from that diphthong. And like I was saying, it's really kind of like one root, right? It's one root vowel, one nucleus. And that's how it's pronounced in a sense, kjosan. So it's one vowel, not two vowels. And then, of course, we see in Gothic, kjosan. So again, you're hearing that palatal sound. So for those of you who are wondering sometimes who study these old languages, like, in Old High German or in Old Saxon, do I pronounce that I as an I or do I pronounce that I as a J? If it's coming from a diphthong, it's going to be pronounced like the ya J sound, like the kjosan and not kiosan. And you know that now because you ask yourself, does this I-O, for example, come from a diphthong in Proto-Germanic? And if it does, then yes, it's more like a ya sound, kjosan. And again, it's very clearly written in Old Norse with kjosa. And then, of course, with our Indo-European example, we see here in Greek, geu, geu. So you see that the E and the U is preserved in Greek. So again, if you have this E and this U preserved in Greek and other Indo-European languages, and then you have runic with the EU, well, your oldest form is going to be that EU. And for my very last example here, we're going to look at the verb for to pour in Proto-Germanic. So this is geltana or geltanan. Geltana, geltanan, depending on your reconstruction. So we can then expect that the EU will shift to an EO in Old Saxon, right? Again, sometimes it's IO, but the EO is going to obviously be the older form. So we see Yeltan, Yeltan, not Yeotan, Yeltan. In Old English, we see Yeltan, Yeltan. In Old Norse, we see Gjota, Gjota, just like we saw Kjosa and Gjodan. So again, systematic shifts everywhere from EU. And then we have Old High German, Gjosan, and then Gothic, Gjutan. And then, of course, we have the E preserved in the Greek example I'm showing you right here with keo. Keo. All right, so that's all I have for you all today. I'm sure you can see how the diphthongs are a lot harder to talk about than just the single vowels, the monophthongs, like the short I's and the long I's and short E's and long E's. It's definitely not as messy, as we have to deal with some of these diphthongs. And with the diphthongs, you see that we also have to rely on some Indo-European evidence and runic evidence too, to really back up why we would want to reconstruct, an AI or an EU or an AU and so on and so forth. So I also tried to give you as many examples as I could in unconditioned environments. Basically, that means like, oh, this is just how this vowel shifts in this language, not this is how this vowel shifts in this language, except before a dental, like you saw in the old High German example with the word for red. Those are conditioned environments. And so in my next video, I'm going to talk about some, conditioned environments and some things called like vowel fronting and vowel rounding. It also occurred to me too that a lot of people talk about fronting and rounding, and your typical person has no clue what the heck people are talking about sometimes. It's like, what do you mean a vowel is fronted? And so in my next video, I'm going to talk about that too and show you how vowels are fronted phonetically in the mouth and what that actually even means. All right, everyone. Well, that's all I have for you today. And in my next video, like I said, I'll go ahead and talk about weird things like vowel fronting and nasal spirant laws and, all the other nuanced stuff. After that, I'll do some consonants, and that'll be it for at least for a little while regarding the sounds on this YouTube channel.